In 1985, the expedition led by Robert Ballard found the Titanic. The cameras swept across the hull on the ocean floor. They broadcasted images of that four-funnel giant to the entire world. But there is one door that the team filmed, paused in front of, and deliberately never crossed. It was not for a lack of equipment, nor was it for a lack of time. Confidential records showed that the compartment was identified. A brief discussion took place in the control cabin, and the decision to pull back was made. That door remained sealed in the darkness for another 15 years. When divers finally broke the lock, what they found inside contradicted absolutely everything the White Star Line Company had officially declared after the tragedy. The most famous ocean liner in the history of maritime engineering was meticulously designed. Decades later, it was exhaustively mapped on the ocean floor. We are talking about a giant. It housed 840 passenger cabins. It had 29 massive boilers feeding the steel heart of the vessel. There were also 2 vast engine rooms and hundreds of logistical compartments. Almost all of this has already been inspected through the lenses of remotely operated vehicles. But deep within this intricate submerged labyrinth, nearly 13,000 feet below the surface, only one single room received a peculiar classification. This came from the company holding the physical exploration rights to the wreck. Only one space was officially labeled as a restricted access area in the internal expedition documents. It was a cold, strictly bureaucratic designation. It sparked closed-door debates, and it was never truly explained or justified to the public, who simply consumes the official story. This isolated space did not hold the monumental engines. It did not hold the navigation maps or the command logs from the bridge. It was, in fact, the chief purser's main office. To truly understand the historical and financial weight housed behind that armored door, we must go back in time. We must return to the grim early morning hours of April 14, 1912. The ship was slowly coming to a halt in the middle of the North Atlantic. It was just after that fateful scraping blow along the side against the immense block of ice. A silent scene of apprehension and contained despair was unfolding in the most luxurious corridors of first class. Even before the general order to abandon ship became evident to everyone, figures of immense power formed a discreet line. Yet they were driven by an absolute urgency. They stood right in front of that exact frame of solid wood and steel. They were not there in that first critical moment searching for limited spots on the lifeboats. They were handing over everything of the highest physical value they carried. They gave it directly into the hands of the senior officer in charge of securing valuables. These were family heirlooms passed down through generations. There were bulky envelopes containing exorbitant amounts of cash, irrevocable land deeds, and heavy sets of jewelry representing untouchable fortunes were all handed over. The officers in the room maintained a firm posture. Their grim faces reflected the gravity and coldness their positions demanded. They worked as fast as they possibly could. They recorded item by item every single piece in a formal, detailed inventory. That simple sheet of paper became the very last official record of an incalculable wealth. It was reluctantly filled out under the flickering light of incandescent bulbs that, very soon, would fail for good. The ocean would invade the space ruthlessly. It would swallow the structure, exacting its human toll, and it would seal in darkness the great safe that guarded the fiduciary power of those families. The unwritten yet logical rule of deep-water archaeological exploration dictates a very simple premise. If a billion-dollar expedition finds a preserved safe or a structurally intact door in a wreck of this magnitude, the immediate and natural step is clear. You try to discover what survived inside. However, the passageway isolating the purser's office remained untouched for exactly 114 years. It was not the crushing pressure of the ocean floor that blocked the probes from entering. It was not the dangerous debris of twisted metal piled up in the hallway that prevented access. The isolation was guaranteed by a purely corporate and human decision. It was arranged in offices on dry land, and it was executed in absolute silence, deep within the silence of the sea. This is the dark turning point that the vast majority of traditional accounts choose to ignore. Most never even question it. Today, we are going to cross that protective barrier. We will understand why that specific compartment, with a door that withstood the violent impact of the sinking, generated so much legal discomfort. If you value authentic and respectful historical documentation, subscribe to the channel to follow our upcoming investigations. Because what the confidential reports reveal about the inside of this room changes everything. It definitively alters our perception of the respect for the memory of the event. It changes how we view the complex legal battles that followed, and most importantly, it redefines the final destiny of what many believe to be the true financial heart of the ship. The atmosphere in the expedition's command room in September 1985 was dense and exhausting. The lighting came almost exclusively from the greenish glow of tube monitors. It cast severe shadows across the navigation panels. The faces of the oceanographers and officers reflected a profound fatigue. It was carved by long, sleepless nights of relentless searching. There was no room for smiles or relaxed features on those perfectly ordinary yet tense faces. There was only the raw responsibility of men who knew exactly what they were doing. They were invading a steel graveyard, resting nearly 13,000 feet deep. The silence inside the cabin was broken only by the continuous hum of the control equipment. It created a mechanical and solemn atmosphere wrapped in a purely instrumental tension. The video cameras of the remotely operated vehicle swept the ocean floor. They illuminated enormous twisted plates lying in the darkness of the North Atlantic. They exhaustively documented the entire exterior. They photographed the ghostly outlines of that immense four-funnel marvel of naval engineering. The strict protocol of underwater exploration demands technical precision. Every square inch reached by the powerful lights must be cataloged. It was exactly during one of these methodical sweeps that the submersible revealed a stunning structural anomaly. The internal logs of the mission, with excerpts published quietly only in the year 1987, point to the exact moment. The team located the coordinates corresponding to the chief purser's main office. The long corridor surrounding this area had suffered severe damage. This happened during the violent descent of the bow toward the oceanic abyss. The ship's structure was heavily compromised right from the very beginning. It started with the fateful lateral scrape against the mountain of ice. It was a continuous, largely submerged impact long before the vessel broke in half on the surface. But through some physical miracle that defies immediate comprehension, the thick main door of this office resisted the destruction. The heavily treated wood and the steel hinges remained incredibly firm. They formed a completely intact physical barrier right in the middle of a chaos of twisted iron. For those unfamiliar with the behind-the-scenes logic of underwater searches, it is vital to understand an essential principle. Deep water archaeology has a golden rule. When researchers find a strictly sealed door in such a hostile environment, under absolutely crushing pressure, it represents the pinnacle of discovery. An intact door means its interior has been heavily protected. It is shielded from violent ocean currents and aggressive microorganisms. Whatever is inside remains in a vacuum of degradation. It is preserved as a true armored time capsule. The technically expected reaction would be to cautiously force a mechanical entry, or, at the very least, to position delicate fiber optic micro cameras through the small cracks to record the internal space. However, the records confirm that the robotic vehicle simply halted its advance. The small propellers stabilized the heavy machine millimeter by millimeter right in front of the entrance. There was a rapid and nervous exchange of confidential radio commands with the coordination team on the surface. The definitive order, passed from the superior officer directly into the hands of the pilot, was set in stone. They were to pull the machine back immediately. They were not to open the door under any circumstances. The official justification was repeated categorically by the chief explorer responsible for revealing the find to the world. It was based on an immense respect for the historical preservation of the resting place. The corporate claim was that the interior of the room should remain untouched. This was done in the name of a respectful memory for the hundreds of people who did not survive that freezing early morning. It is a very strong ethical argument. It was perfectly designed to calm the major international press and the general public. But there is a grave and undeniable inconsistency in this widely accepted official narrative. The very same technological vehicle forced its way into and illuminated dozens of other intimate, highly sensitive compartments. The robot focused its meticulous lenses on once luxurious private cabins. It documented long, collapsed social corridors. The severe policy of not touching the heritage based on maximum respect was applied absolutely and officially against this specific wooden door alone. No other passenger cabin or crew area received this surprising level of blockade throughout the entire primary mission. Have you ever felt that chill down your spine? That feeling when you realize a seemingly noble decision might hide much more complex motivations? Why exactly were the strict criteria of environmental sanctity raised as an insurmountable barrier only in front of the one safe that guarded the vessel's massive financial power? The focused operators sitting in front of the screens knew how to read the shipyard's old architectural blueprints perfectly. They consciously knew that this coveted space was not a mere logistical storage room. It was the unquestionable center of private wealth for the entire ship. The deliberate decision to ignore access sealed a tense pact of silence. It would stretch on for 15 long years. The heavy door remained standing, armored and frozen in absolute darkness. In the distance, the majestic, inert hull offered a grand and silent vision on the ocean floor. It provided an imposing breath of eternity amidst the unfathomable abyss. Meanwhile, international lawyers looked at those recorded videos and saw only a gigantic safe protected by the alibi of pure science. And the vast handwritten inventory proved that untouchable fortunes were waiting on the other side of that dark wood. To understand what would justify such a severe access blockade by the exploration team, we must look away from the ocean floor. We need to turn our attention to the heavy archives of American and British courts right after the year 1912. What rested in the silence of that room was not just a lost treasure from maritime legends or fishermen's tales. It was the physical, tangible proof of real fortunes. These were assets that generated absolutely colossal legal battles on the surface. The most powerful families of that era did not just mourn their immeasurable human losses. They sued the White Star Line Company with a relentless firmness, and they were backed by the best lawyers in the world. And it is exactly in the detailed records of these lawsuits that the heavy weight of this mystery reaches its breaking point. The legal documents, kept under lock and key for decades, bear the names of the most influential figures of that era. Men and women who, on the freezing early morning of April 14th, walked through the already slightly tilted corridors of first class. They had a single urgent destination before heading up to the boat deck. Benjamin Guggenheim, a man known for his unshakable posture in the face of adversity, handed a thick, sealed envelope to the purser. He did this shortly before returning to the upper lounges to face his end with absolute sobriety. John Jacob Astor IV, unquestionably the richest man on board and owner of an immeasurable financial empire, had stacks of confidential documents and massive sums recorded under the strict custody of the main safe. Names of immense prestige, like Lady Duff Gordon and the magnate Isidor Straus, also appeared irrefutably on the lines of that emergency inventory. The atmosphere of that exact moment carries an almost palpable density. The freezing air of the Atlantic was already creeping into the lower decks. It brought with it the silent certainty of inevitable collapse. The officers in charge maintained a rigid posture. Their perfectly ordinary faces were marked by exhaustion and extreme tension. There was no room for even a trace of calm. They received exclusive jewelry boxes, heavy property deeds, and piles of cold, hard cash. They locked everything inside that office, built of steel and hardwood. They turned the heavy security locks, and they handed tiny paper receipts to people who, in just a few short hours, would no longer be there to demand them back. It was a massive vault being filled at the exact moment those people's world was literally sinking. It was dominated by the steep plunge of the Bull. This was long before the colossal structure could no longer bear its own weight, tearing violently in half as the stern disappeared into the darkness for good. When the maritime tragedy was complete, the world woke up to the loss of more than 1,500 lives. The widows and heirs of the first-class passengers demanded severe reparations. International courts evaluated the evidence. They formally recognized the multi-million-dollar deposits made on that fateful night. The shipping company was cornered legally. They were forced to pay massive cash settlements to cover the losses declared by the survivors. However, the physical objects of incalculable value were gone. The exclusive family jewels, the coveted diamonds, and the original documents were never returned to their rightful owners. The legal justification presented by the company's lawyers was irrefutable. It was perfectly convenient to shut down the exhausting debates. The assets were, officially, inaccessible at the dark bottom of the ocean. They had been locked away forever in the purser's room. They were protected by thousands of tons of salt water, surrounded by twisted metal, and guarded by crushing pressure. They were declared out of reach, lost for eternity. At least, that was the absolute and undeniable truth right up until the moment that door was finally found intact. 15 years after being ignored and protected by the first expedition, the decision to break the lock was finally made before the eyes of the world. And what came out of there would forever change the course of the entire established narrative. The historical clock ticked silently forward for 15 years, since the first visual contact with the wreckage. We arrived at the year 2000. Public interest in the mystery resting at the bottom of the North Atlantic had reached its absolute peak. The company holding the exploration rights decided it was the exact right time. It was time to cross the threshold of that thick wooden door that had been deliberately ignored in the 1980s. And they would not do it in the dark, away from the public eye. They mounted an operation of global magnitude. Images were captured nearly 13,000 feet deep. They were broadcast live to an estimated audience of 30 million viewers around the world. The atmosphere surrounding what the ocean hides and what has been recovered is incredibly dense. So many details get lost in common retellings. That is why, to prepare this script, I analyzed material of incalculable documentary value. It is for anyone who truly wants to understand the engineering and the secrets of this giant. It is the digital ebook, The Anatomy of the Giant. A complete historical dossier gathering more than 100 exclusive facts. It covers everything from the details of its construction to the stunning objects recovered by modern expeditions. It is an essential visual guide, an immersive experience to understand everything about the ship. If you value true historical research, the official link to get the material is in the first pinned comment right below. But right now, I ask you to turn your attention back to the ocean floor. The moment of breakthrough was about to happen. The robotic vehicles descended once more into the freezing darkness. They illuminated the imposing silhouette of the ancient four funnels that marked the structural greatness of the ship. High-definition cameras focused on the restricted corridor. The door, once protected by a silent pact of untouchability, finally gave way. It yielded to the mechanical precision of heavy robotic arms. The command team on the surface guided the machines. They were technicians and oceanographers with rigid, exhausted, perfectly normal faces. They were deeply aware of the historical weight. There was not the slightest trace of inappropriate celebration. They maneuvered through a space that had not seen the light of day since the early morning of 1912. The central goal was not just to dig through the office drawers. The mission was to physically extract the main safe that held the official deposits. The massive artifact was isolated, strapped, and carefully hoisted. It traveled up through miles of dense, dark water. It broke the foaming surface of the ocean. It was gently placed on the steel deck of the support ship, under the harsh glare of television spotlights. 30 million people held their breath in almost perfect unison. The whole world was waiting. They expected the blinding shine of the Guggenheim family's precious stones, the undeniable weight of John Jacob Astor IV's gold, the priceless heirloom necklaces, and the heavy jewels that American courts had sworn existed under the company's custody. Specialists, wearing surgical protective gloves and using precision tools, unlocked the highly oxidized internal mechanisms. The steel door of the vault was finally forced open. It happened in real time, right before the eyes of the entire planet. The dark interior was exposed to the cameras, and the tense silence that took over the deck was immediate. It was deafening. From inside that hermetic compartment, which was supposed to house the greatest maritime treasure of the 20th century, the technicians pulled out very little. They found only bundles of severely deteriorated paper banknotes, a few small blackened coins, fragmented leather folders containing documents rendered completely illegible, destroyed by a century of moisture. Not a single precious stone, no glowing necklaces, not one single item of extreme value that would justify the precise descriptions made in the first-class inventory. The official explanation was provided almost immediately by corporate representatives right in front of the cameras. It was highly technical and coldly calculated. They declared that the relentless action of time had taken its toll. The extreme pressure of the abyss and the high salinity of the water had supposedly corroded and dissolved the assets over the decades. But there is an undeniable fact regarding the pure chemistry of the elements. The greatest jewelers and experts pointed it out sharply the very next day. It is a very simple, silent truth that tears apart any forced corporate narrative. Paper does indeed fall apart. Leather yields to time. Steel succumbs to rust. But genuine gold does not deteriorate in seawater. Diamonds are virtually indestructible against oceanic pressure. Precious stones and noble metals do not melt. They do not shrink. And they simply do not disappear in salt water. The door had been sealed and armored far from human contact for 114 years. And yet, against all odds, the most resistant and valuable artifacts were not there. The glare of the cameras and the global broadcast to 30 million people created a perfect illusion. It felt like total transparency. When the world saw the bundles of rotting paper and the absolute absence of precious metals or structured jewelry, the vast majority accepted the official answer of corrosion. They simply moved on with their lives. But the true exploration of that armored office did not end when the television studio lights went out. It did not end when the deep sea feed was cut. Far away from the direct scrutiny of the public, the behind the scenes of this very same expedition reveal something else. It exposes a much more complex and dense narrative, archived in absolute silence. Professional divers and submarine technicians actively participated in the recovery missions. Many years later, they started giving extremely discreet interviews to specialized media outlets. They were experienced men. Their faces were deeply marked by the exhaustion and chronic tension of operating in the abyss. Their features, captured in these rare conversations, were ordinary and severe. There was no trace of relaxation or a smile as they remembered their work on the ocean floor. They described primary sorting operations that were absolutely not included in the festive television broadcast. They reported the existence of small boxes and solid artifacts, cataloged internally, items that never made it to the brightly lit display cases of the major international public exhibitions. To understand the true magnitude of everything pulled from the bottom of the North Atlantic over the decades, we must look away from the sea. We need to look at the facilities on dry land. The company RMS Titanic Incorporated, which holds the recovery rights, maintains a highly secret and strictly controlled warehouse in the city of Atlanta. There, it houses more than 5,500 rescued artifacts. Every single object that crosses the surface goes into an isolated and sterile environment. It is subjected to long chemical stabilization processes. This prevents the item from disintegrating upon contact with the open air. The conservation work inside happens in a climate of extreme secrecy, far away from any outside interference. The great breaking point of this investigation and the source of legal discomfort lie in the heavy lawsuits that followed. Years after that televised safe opening, the American government itself got involved. Various government agencies dragged the company into complex and exhausting litigation. They harshly questioned the custody practices and the exact destination of certain batches of artifacts. Lawyers with impenetrable expressions pored over reports and inventories, documents that remain, to this day, under heavy partial judicial seal. The law intervened decisively. In the year 2012, an American court officially recognized the wreck site as a protected maritime memorial. This tightened the grip even further on what can and cannot be displayed. But the central truth, attested by these long years of litigation, is clear. There is an extensive list of materials originating from the expeditions of that period. However, access to the full content of these pages remains blocked. Pages that detail meticulously what was actually removed from the restricted access area and from the corridors surrounding the sealed door, the passageway that isolated the old financial heart of the ship gave way on live television. The small internal safe was exposed for the planet to see, and yet the complete, real inventory of what the robotic vehicles rescued in the darkness of the sea remains an absolute secret. The great protective barrier is no longer the immense pressure of the ocean. It has become the heavy, inaccessible bureaucracy of the courts. If the central valuables room was supposedly empty when the heavy door was forced open on camera in the year 2000, a very simple question began to echo silently. Where exactly did the highly valuable pieces come from? The ones that began to circulate discreetly in closed auctions and private collections in the years immediately following? The answer to this question does not rest at the bottom of the oceanic abyss. It lies in the cruel discrepancies of the official timeline itself. Long before that live broadcast to the world earlier, much less publicized expeditions had already mapped and explored the vast debris field. Documentary records point out unquestioningly that the company responsible for the operations recovered more than 5,500 physical artifacts during its primary missions. And it is exactly in the middle of this extensive hidden catalog that the narrative of seawater corrosion begins to crumble. There is one specific, properly documented artifact that perfectly illustrates this massive contradiction. In the year 1987, exactly 13 years before the internal safe was opened in front of the press, robotic vehicles brought a small, sturdy leather bag to the surface. Inside it, perfectly intact and indifferent to the crushing pressure, rested a ring. It was adorned with 3 diamonds, featuring a stunning 2-carat center stone. Experts confirmed that this highly valuable piece belonged with almost absolute certainty to the ship's purser himself. This was the exact officer directly in charge of collecting and guarding the priceless belongings of the highest class passengers during the tense, chaotic moments of the evacuation. The intention of that man, acting under a strict protection protocol, was to organize custody so he could return the assets safely. But that return never happened. A strong visual contrast is drawn when we look away from the modern cold law offices, places occupied by executives with severe, ordinary faces. Instead, we return to contemplate the grandeur of the original vessel. That four-funnel colossus glided across the mirrored surface of the Atlantic. It was imposing and majestic, right before suffering the continuous side scrape that would doom its structure. The immensity and the tragedy of the ship collide. A ship that would sink bow first before violently tearing in half. This reality clashes hard against the pettiness of the legal disputes that followed decades later. The tension over the final possession of these assets reached its breaking point in the year 2016. That is when the exploration company filed for bankruptcy. Absolute rights over the priceless heritage became fiercely contested by huge international consortiums. The law tried to step in repeatedly. Since the year 2012, American courts had already tried to hit the brakes on purely commercial exploration. They formally recognized the wreck site as a protected maritime memorial. But the heavy armored doors on dry land had already slammed shut on the vast majority of the collection. The greatest valuables deposited on the night of the disaster were not dissolved by time. Rather, they were methodically absorbed by the silent gears of the great international artifact market. The heavy oak and steel door remained sealed in the darkness for 114 years. When it finally gave way on live television, under the blinding glare of spotlights for 30 million people, the world's expectation crashed into rotting paper. But the absence of fortunes in the televised safe does not mean the room was empty when the ocean swallowed it. The four-funnel giant sank bow first. It tore in half and took to the bottom the secrets of over 1,500 people. People who did not survive that freezing early morning of April 14, 1912. The most valuable items of the first class were hastily locked away in that restricted room. They were handed over to officers with tense, ordinary faces. They were given by hands that knew the vessel was doomed after the severe scraping against the block of ice. The structural door was broken down by modern technology. However, the truth about the hidden inventories and the real destiny of the immense wealth remains locked away. It is protected now by the inaccessible human bureaucracies on dry land. On that freezing night, under a solemn and strictly instrumental atmosphere, free from any human whisper that could break the heavy sound of the sea, the ship fell silent. If you demand true historical research with no shortcuts, subscribe to the channel. The sea might corrode the steel and swallow the belongings, but we will keep searching for the memory that time tries to erase.